Hi, everybody. History Speaks here, and I'm delighted to have today as an interviewee Dr. Annelle Sheline, who is a research fellow at the Middle East program of the Quincy Institute. And Annelle drew public attention in March 2024 for her resignation as she had been serving as a foreign affairs officer at the U.S. State Department's Bureaucracy of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor's Office of Near Eastern Affairs. She resigned in protest of the Biden administration's support for the Israeli genocidal war in Gaza. So we're delighted to have today Dr. Annelle Sheline. Good to be with you, Annelle.
Thanks so much for having me.
Before I probe your biography a bit, Annelle, the news of the day, of course, just yesterday, we're recording this on the 5th of February 2025. Just yesterday, President Trump appeared to articulate support for a coercive long-term ethnic cleansing program for the Gaza Strip. What are your reactions to this, and do you have any contacts in government who are still in the Trump administration and are reacting to this? And what's your personal reaction to the likelihood of the policy taking place and the implications of both a potential policy as well as just the rhetoric of ethnic cleansing?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone is really still reeling from this. These questions of to what extent is he serious about this? Some people have said, is this him trying to stake some kind of maximalist position? This seems to be perhaps what we're hearing from people like Marco Rubio or other officials within the White House saying, the idea, even like National Security Advisor Waltz was saying, no, the idea is he kind of stakes this out and then the Arab states jump in to make sure that, we don't actually have the United States occupying Gaza, which, I mean, to a certain extent, that's as plausible as anything else, any other explanation right now. I mean, I think just the insanity of this is what people are sort of reacting to, in part just remembering that the U.S. military wasn't capable of building a functional pier off the coast of Gaza. And certainly there were questions there of to what extent was that ever meant as anything other than a PR stint. I agree that was simply a PR stint. And then it seemed that this was actually used for the U.S. military to then be involved in some Israeli military actions, which is a whole other issue entirely.
Particularly one of the hostage rescue operations, which I think resulted in hundreds of presumably civilian casualties,
Exactly.
reportedly made use of this pier.
Exactly. And so, people may ask, the pier may have not been undertaken with the same degree of seriousness as something like this would be, but still, you don't need to look back very far into history to look at the failed nation building in Iraq or Afghanistan, to say nothing of the failure of the Israeli military's efforts to seize control of the Gaza Strip over the past 15 months to scratch. I'm scratching my head over how in any way this goes along with what Trump has said he stands for, which is achieving peace in the Middle East, reducing America's military footprint, no longer engaging in endless wars. And this, from my understanding, is a big part of his appeal, to his base and to the American people who don't want to see any more wars like what we saw in Iraq or Afghanistan. So it's I think it was quite interesting that we saw a very clear statement from the Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Yeah, very quick. In fact, in the middle of the night, they issued
Exactly.
an emphatic statement rejecting the policy.
Exactly. Although that wasn't from Mohammed bin Salman himself, ostensibly the MFA wouldn't have put something out without BS signing off on it. And so this does seem to be quite clear from the Saudi perspective. But you had asked if I was in touch with contacts in the Trump administration. No, I don't have a lot of contacts inside Trump world. But I do think, just, thinking about yesterday as people were anticipating Trump and Netanyahu's meeting and what sort of goodies Trump was likely to
Mm,
promise Netanyahu.
yeah.
And I know I was especially focused on the fact that I assume Netanyahu would say something like, I can't move to the next phase of the ceasefire deal, even if Trump was trying to get him to do so, because my government will fall apart. And yet at the same time, you
Hmm.
had members of the Israeli opposition who'd said publicly, but this hadn't been reported in English, it was reported in Hebrew, that they had said, we'll join Netanyahu's government in order to get all the Israeli hostages home. So his excuse that his government would fall apart if he moved to the next phase of the deal because Smotrich would leave wasn't actually true. And so, then when what actually came out was this statement about the United States taking control of Gaza and engaging in ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, that as people have said, that wasn't on their bingo card.
Yeah, certainly not. And I'll just latch on to one comment you made, Annelle, because it relates to a piece you wrote for the Quincy Institute, with which I disagreed, but I want you to make your case here, that you thought that the ceasefire agreement was rather a sham and that Israel was poised to violate it. And my sense is that the ceasefire is not a sham insofar as the military situation in Gaza is very grim indeed from Israel's perspective. They weren't even trying in the last several months of the war to conquer and hold the territory of Gaza in a sense that would be required to root out this group, to root out Hamas, to burrow into the tunnels, to clear the tunnels. They weren't even trying to occupy Gaza thoroughly in the way that would destroy Hamas. So it seemed to me that the ceasefire was likely to hold because of the military situation. But you're more skeptical, it sounds.
Yeah, I'm extremely grateful that my initial pessimism, and so my concern was that Trump had said, I want a ceasefire in place for my inauguration, and I was worried that that was as far as he cared to think about it. And so
Mm-hmm.
I was concerned that maybe he just wanted to be able to say, I got what Biden couldn't, and now, please proceed and carry on with your genocide. Um, However, and especially given his statements yesterday, it does seem that he is in fact serious about apparently having the United States take control and take over responsibility for the occupation of Gaza, and but that part of that is the ceasefire. I do think that part of this may have to do with the influence of Miriam Adelson,
Mm.
the money she's given his campaign over years, not just this most recent election, and the extent to which she and other Zionist extremists are focused on the West Bank and that sort of bogging down the Israeli military in Gaza, tanking the Israeli economy over this, wasn't serving their broader agenda of annexation and control of the West Bank. We know that King Abdullah of Jordan is going to be coming to DC next week. We know Trump is already pressuring Abdullah because he's frozen all aid to Jordan as well as aid to everywhere else except for Israel and Egypt. So I certainly agree that my initial sense that the ceasefire agreement was merely sort of a sort of feather in Trump's cap for the inauguration seems clear. He's got big plans for the region.
Yeah, and really, I look at the ethnic cleansing project. Whether or not it's carried out probably won't be, although we have to fight it politically. Whether or not it's carried out in this big dramatic way of an expulsion, or gradually by making, by preventing the reconstruction of the strip and hobbling the introduction of more humanitarian aid, whether it's a long-term project. I think that's probably the next approach Israel will take, because having lost militarily in Gaza, they think they might be able to liquidate Hamas through this ethnic cleansing project, which would either isolate the guerrillas if you ethnically cleanse the people, the civilians, but not Hamas, or if you proportionally remove Hamas fighters as well in ethnic cleansing, decimating them as a group. So What do you think of that? Do you think it's perhaps some attempt to win the war through other means?
I mean, I don't know that that I've heard anyone from Trump's orbit articulate anything more specific about what exactly this would entail. Trump seems to believe that the Palestinians in Gaza would welcome the opportunity to leave. Um, but you raise very important questions about what exactly would be done. And already we know, obviously, the leaders of Jordan and Egypt have categorically and have long categorically rejected any sort of displacement or ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, or that they would accept them or do anything to undermine do anything, that they would take those kinds of steps to undermine the creation of a state of Palestine, knowing how unpopular this would be. But right, so if actually we have Trump thinking he can strong arm Abdullah, for example, into taking hundreds of thousands, a million, however many Palestinians, this question of, well, right, are we, I mean, this was a question I also tried to raise in this notion of displacing Palestinians. I mean, this happened after the creation of the State of Israel.
Of course,
and
yeah.
It wasn't as if that led to peace and stability. You know, you had guerrilla groups operating in Jordan and not in Egypt, because there were not as many. But I think obviously this is part of why Egypt is feeling extremely concerned about this, not only for the domestic repercussions politically this would have for Sisi, but the security fallout that would likely result. So again, this notion that Palestinians could simply be removed and that would solve the issue, whether or not there's an effort to sort of try and extricate Hamas from the civilian population. I mean, you know, the argument has long been made that even if somehow in some magical scenario Israel or the United States was able to actually eliminate Hamas, obviously the level of violence that Palestinians have experienced over the last 15 months is going to lead to some new iteration of a resistance, and likely a violent resistance.
Yeah, certainly. And I would just remark that I think this is rather a desperation ploy by Israel, because they haven't been able to provide for security. They haven't been able to destroy Hamas in Gaza, and they're just trying to, as they put it, that many of their officials think outside of the box with this ethnic cleansing project. That's one way to put it, certainly. Okay, Annelle, I want to now step back a bit and then just talk about your personal biography, because as I began with, you drew a lot of attention for your resignation in March 2024 over the Biden administration's support for Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. But even before that, I'm curious, how did you get interested in, describe just a bit of your academic background. I know you're a political scientist, and how did you get interested in the Arab world and the Middle East and develop expertise in these matters?
I mean, I think like many people, American millennials, 9/11 was a big moment. I was in high school at the time, and although I can't claim that I, from that moment on, dedicated my life to studying the Middle East, it certainly was. It was so prominent growing up, and I remember I was shocked initially at the level of Islamophobia that became apparent even within hours of the attack. Even at the time when it still wasn't clear it could have been another Timothy McVeigh, another like Oklahoma City domestic terrorism. It was not.
Were you in high school or university at the time, or?
I was in high school.
Okay, yeah.
And yet again, so before anybody knew who had carried out 9/11, just the immediate reaction that, this was the Muslims and we have to like go after the Muslims in response. I remember just being sort of struck by that, of like, where where was that coming from? And this was from, like other dumb kids at my high school saying these kinds of things. So I ended up studying Arabic in undergrad and spending some time in the Middle East, and then moving to Egypt after I graduated, working as a journalist. I smile because, I wasn't like I was with the New York Times or anything. I was with the Daily News Egypt, which is a local publication in Cairo. And then kind of right before the Arab Spring happened, I decided I was going to come back and pursue a PhD focusing on the Middle East. And then obviously with the Arab Spring, sort of renewed attention to the region. And, I think so not to bore your listeners, but just quickly, so I sort of was in the academic realm, ended up at a think tank, and then in part because directly because I had a Boren Fellowship, which is one of the many ways that the U.S. government fosters the study of critical languages. That meant that I owed the government a year. And so I was brought into the State Department because I had preferential hiring status in order to fulfill this obligation. So I just so happened to be at State. I'd been there for only about 6 months when October 7th happened. And, I think I was already coming from I had been at the Quincy Institute, where I now have returned to, which is a think tank that is quite critical of U.S. foreign policy. And so I was not headed into the State Department with a necessarily very rosy view of what I would find there, but I did think it could be useful to see how things looked from the inside. And obviously it was an opportunity. And I also needed to pay back the government for this Arabic language fellowship given me.
So I see that you, of course, worked specifically in human rights in the State Department. So this is an interesting, I think, paradox, particularly because Quincy and your own views are critical of American foreign policy intervention. I'm a big believer in human rights and I teach about the human rights revolution and how these concepts became much more politically viable and engaged the world after the Second World War, especially. However, there's always a paradox in human rights insofar as we're coming in as the West of the United States and saying we're the good people. Here are the good liberal values on women, on LGBT, on free speech, and so on. And I think there is inevitably some paternalism there. Did you, even before October 7th, when I think your position becomes untenable, as I think you'd acknowledge, but even before October 7th, did you see this tension in human rights advocacy that we're the U.S., we're the State Department? Sure, we may have people of different ethnic backgrounds, but ultimately we're Westerners, and we're coming in and telling you guys how to live and what the right thing to do is? Or do you think that there isn't, that I'm exaggerating this tension, you're working with people in these countries against the state, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting to see, first of all, the extent to which human rights is marginalized within U.S. foreign policy, that it was in no way driving foreign policy, except when used against countries that are seen as adversaries. So, it's the first thing the U.S. likes to talk about when it comes to China or Iran or Syria, before, I mean, inshallah, we'll see what ends up happening with the new government of Syria, but certainly under Assad. And so, but obviously, it is not the first thing the U.S. government likes to talk about with the Saudis, even though it should be, or the Egyptians, or the Moroccans, or, any of these other governments, or, even Ukraine.
Yeah.
Though certainly do like to talk about it with Russia. So it was interesting because, like, on the one hand, I was surrounded by other people for whom human rights is very important, and this is what they do, and some of them had spent years working on human rights advocacy and knowing that they were operating within a much broader system that didn't for whom human rights was not the first priority, but they still saw it as valuable to try to do what they could to the extent that that was possible. And, especially in the Middle East, working the level of authoritarianism that has unfortunately sort of retrenched in the aftermath of the Arab Spring is quite disheartening and has had a significant impact on civil society across the region. And so to the extent that the U.S. government was willing to try to provide some support or to push back against, when these governments are torturing political prisoners or locking up journalists or, just otherwise engaging in really gross violations of human rights, that was something that I personally found meaningful to be able to be a part of. At the same time, in the aftermath of October 7th, and just to be clear, it wasn't as if the U.S. had a whole lot of credibility as an advocate for human rights before October 7th, especially in the Middle East. But after October 7th, it just was no longer tenable to try to come in and say to a foreign government, you really need to do more on your human rights record here.
Yeah.
So,
because there's already that intrinsic tension in terms of who are we to give this moralistic lecture? Even though I think it's important work, there is, I think, that intrinsic tension in human rights advocacy. Who are we to give these lectures? And then after October 7th, it becomes an absurdity, like a sick joke. Yeah.
Well, and what I did find was inside the State Department, there wasn't a lot of questioning of the appropriateness that the U.S. would engage in this sort of finger wagging. I think there was very much a belief in the U.S. should do more of this. Human rights should be more of a focus. Which I'm not saying it shouldn't. To the extent that actually, if the United States were to follow our own laws, we would not sell weapons to countries that engage in these levels of human rights violations. That's a law that has never actually been applied, but it is on the books technically. So
you're just to back up slightly, Annelle, your work involved. Did you and a team compile reports on? Did you write, for example, the reports on human rights practices, which are published? Okay, these publicly available reports, and theoretically these should steer U.S. policy or inform the State Department and so on, but they end up just languishing and collecting dust probably.
Well, and what's funny is, again, as I said, people within my office who are really committed to human rights and this belief that human rights should play a bigger role in U.S. foreign policy, sometimes what you would get, some of what existed within those human rights reports wasn't even known by other parts of the State Department. And, I'm thinking about the example of Ukraine, where the U.S. State Department was acknowledging human rights violations by the Ukrainian government, but that's not something you would hear the Biden administration mention. But they are there, and they went through, they had to be approved and go through the whole process.
Interesting.
Similarly, human rights violations by Israel were extremely well documented by the Human Rights Report.
Are these reports, do they undergo some level of political scrutiny before they're published? So you get your team, and then the fellow upstairs says, like, Mr. Blinken objects to this paragraph and this coda. Does that happen, or?
It usually wouldn't make it that far because people know way down the chain sort of what's acceptable.
Yeah.
At the same time, so it's much more a question. So often what would end up happening would be the office where I was sitting working on human rights at the State Department in D.C. is having to engage with the U.S. Embassy in the country, which when every time these human rights reports come out, the local government, the government of Tunisia or Morocco or Israel or whatever says, well, like, why are you writing such nasty things about us in your reports? And the State Department says, well, it's documented. This is all publicly available. None of this is classified information. And so often the embassies on the ground there's a process through which the Human Rights Office and the embassy reconcile what's ultimately going to go into the report.
Oh, interesting. So it's more self-censorship because you understand, like people will understand the lower level that, even leaving aside the genocide question, if one were to accuse Israel of even war crimes in like if one were to say Israel has been credibly accused of a use of a starvation strategy in the early months of the war, at least, or indiscriminate bombing, that wouldn't fly in the human rights report. And there's a sense of self-censorship. You don't need the guy upstairs to do his thing.
Yes, and I mean, part of it is also the reports themselves are quite standardized, so you're sort of following a standard procedure.
Formulaic, yeah, I've noticed that. Exactly. I've read some of them, yeah.
And so, if there's something, so the crime of genocide or something, I mean, that's not like part of the formula. So that certainly wouldn't make it in.
Makes sense. Okay, so after October 7th, it's quite clear from really the beginning, just from the rhetoric from Israeli officials and from the pace and intensity of the bombing. I mean, just to give a bit of a footnote, not only the Ministry of Health in Gaza, which provides specific identifying information for fatalities, so we can know their reliability, age, name. Israel issued Loon algorithm compliant ID number, but the nonprofit and independent investigations by, whether we're talking about the New York Times or Air Wars, show that from the very start, October 2023, the bombing after the massacre by Hamas, extraordinary intensity. Really, I think it's safe to say that of 21st century bombing campaigns, the October 2023 was the bloodiest for civilians, women, children, and civilians. So it becomes quite clear, I imagine, very soon after October 7th, that the U.S. is supporting something monstrous. Frankly, it was not your experience, or did it take some time for you to realize the war was not being prosecuted in a way you could justify?
No, it was abundantly clear. And so this is why, for example, when Josh Paul resigned, I think
very early, right? He resigned October, November.
Right. Yeah, I think it was still in October. I think it was within weeks, which was extremely courageous, and in part because Josh was facilitating the transfer of those weapons. I think for him, it's really unconscionable. I think, and there were many people inside state for whom it was apparent very early on what the U.S. was enabling, just the direct role the U.S. was playing in what was happening. And I think, for so many people inside state, myself included, there's sort of this sense that, like, you made it into the State Department, you have to try and make a difference from the inside. What's the alternative? You go stand out front and protest? I mean, this was something I was asked when I made clear that I was planning to resign over this. Although I did not.
Yeah, are you gonna join the 19-year-olds in yelling epithets outside the White House?
Right. Like, you think that's going to be more effective than sort of like being on the inside, which I do think is a big part of how Washington works. I mean, because you have so many people who came to this town who wanted to make a difference. People aren't necessarily motivated to come work for a government agency because they're seeking great financial benefits or glory, but they believe in the process. They believe in the power of the U.S. government to have an impact. And I do think for many people that is kind of an end in itself, or they can kind of justify for themselves it's better that I'm in
It's
the
better than regardless of the crimes my government's committing. It's better that I'm in the inside than not. Of course, though, that conveniently allows one to maintain one's salary and the prestige, the real prestige and social capital that comes with being an Annelle Sheline foreign affairs officer at the U.S. State Department. So
not that there was a whole lot of social capital with that. I mean, to be clear, I was work
yeah,
level, when like Josh was the director of his office, so like
right, yeah.
steps above me in the
Well, I'm just a PhD student, so what I define as social capital may be different than you. But go ahead.
well, having spent a long time as a PhD student,
Yeah.
I definitely um, remember the stress of that. Um, but so, certainly I think there were many people who viewed it as preferable to stay on the inside, to try to have an impact, to do things like send dissent cables. So I and colleagues co-authored a dissent cable, and I signed two other cables. I mean, it's a process that is it is not transparent, and there was a lot of concern about leaks, in part because in November, a dissent cable was leaked, and I think the people whose names were on it, um, it was an issue. They weren't fired, but it was. Um,
From what I understand, so the descent cable, the channel system was established in 1971 during the Vietnam War. And from what I understand, the frequency with which it was used during the war in Gaza was fairly unprecedented for decades.
Exactly. I mean, this is my understanding, and it's very difficult because there is no transparency into it. So, other than senior officials within the State Department, the secretary himself, as well as other senior officials who do have access to all of them, it is not something where, I could find other dissent cables. But we knew that within, I believe, so as of the first ceasefire, so the one that happened around
Hmm.
like Thanksgiving, 6 weeks or 7 weeks after October 7th, there had been, I believe, seven already dissent cables, and then the one that we submitted made eight, and then I signed another one, which I knew was nine. But that there was really no way of knowing how many more there had been until Blinken said in an interview not long before the regime change, that he'd received dozens of dissent cables, which was for me a somewhat shocking admission because that's quite unprecedented. And so to acknowledge the amount of internal dissent, which was not only maybe raised in a meeting or, stated among colleagues, but actually formally registered through the dissent channel, indicates how the broad recognition that this policy was not only elite, just all of the ways in which this was
Hmm.
such a horrible and foolish, immoral, and also just contrary to U.S. security and U.S. interest, to say nothing
Right.
of of others outside of this country. Um, I was I was I was very surprised when Blinken acknowledged the amount of internal dissent he'd received.
Yeah. How much access to additional information did you and your colleagues have in terms of let's say, like the volume of casualties, destruction of infrastructure, or were you relying, frankly, on what informed people outside the State Department were relying on, like human rights, the reports of human rights groups, media, and so forth? Or did you have privy to? Were you and your colleagues privy to more information?
Not much more. I mean, there was certainly information that was compiled, but it wasn't as if the information that we had access to about things like casualty numbers was different than what you could find publicly. Um, I can't go into too much more about that, but just to say it's, the amount of information that we were drawing from, at least especially about casualty numbers, was not different.
It was similar. It was similar to what one who, if one were interested in good faith in the subject, could as just someone in the public ascertain.
Yes.
Okay, it makes sense. So you had this some months then after the war began, between March when you resigned, of kind of a back and forth. So were you kind of struggling with this logic of, should I stay in because it's better on the inside? I can be a voice that's different on these matters. Or did you have like an escape plan after the end of your fellowship? Were you very much planning to resign? And were there conversations you had with colleagues about this subject? Was there like a group of dissenting foreign officers, foreign affairs officers at that state?
Yes. I mean, there are various groups. A lot of them are just sort of threads on Signal of people talking about this. There was also just a recognition inside the State Department that this was just emotionally very difficult. And so like there were support groups for people who could just sort of talk about what this was like. I think especially for American Muslims or Arab Americans, or people who would go home and would be asked by their own communities,
how can you do this? How can you work for these people?
How do you show up to work every morning? And I think for many of those people, they had those questions. So yes, there was certainly a wide group of people who were opposed to this, but obviously, there were not that many who ended up resigning, at least not publicly.
Yeah,
there are other who left, but who didn't do so publicly.
It seems as if the amount of tension and conflict that was in the State Department over this issue, which you could hear kind of faint echoes of in the press even, was a lot greater than the number of people who actually resigned in the end.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So you resign in March 2024. After you resign, the State Department, actually first, when you resigned, was there backlash? Did you have a plan of trying to get public attention? You did get some public attention, which is why we're doing the interview, why you came on my radar, actually. So you did get some. But did you have a plan to garner some kind of public attention, to try to draw attention to the policy? And was there any personal or professional backlash that attended your resignation, given that you've used the term genocide to describe the policy, and that you made a moral statement that you thought you couldn't? I heard this in an interview. It was actually very touching that you said you couldn't look your daughter in the eye. Sorry, do you have a daughter or son?
Yeah, my daughter's 2.
So
when I resigned last year, she was 1.
Yeah.
But certainly that was a big question for me. Thank God she's not aware of these horrors yet. But knowing that eventually she would be, and would start to learn about this, and would say, well, Mom, weren't you at the State Department at that time? Like, what were you doing? And so, I wanted to be able to tell her that I didn't just go along with it. And, for me, I had decided that I was going to resign. Decided I would fulfill the obligation. I had to work for the government for a year. I could have quit earlier, but I decided that I would fulfill the obligation. This partly had to do also with the timing of when the human rights reports were going to be released. I ended up being responsible for 5 of those reports, not solely myself alone. It's a team. There's a lot of group work at the State Department. But I was sort of the point person. And so I also didn't want to leave that burden on any of my colleagues. So decided that sort of fulfilling my year's end obligation would also coincide with sort of wrapping up the human rights reports. And initially, my plan was not to go public, just to sort of, I let it be known quietly, or I let it be known internally that I was resigning over Gaza, but I hadn't planned to go public. In part because I had been there such a short time, I really didn't think anyone would care. You know,
Mm.
at the State Department, seniority really matters. And so, some nobody who'd just been there for a year.
Yeah, you had just brief and capricious stay at the State Department, so why even talk about it? Yeah.
Right, exactly. And I remember my husband saying this when I told him that I let, colleagues knew that I was going to be resigning over Gaza once the year was up. And they said, please go public, you know, please consider going public. And so I decided, well, if it could have any impact at all, I'll go public. And I remember my husband saying, like, nobody's going to care. And I
Hmm.
was like, well, I mean, even if nobody cares, maybe someone will care.
No,
And
some people cared, definitely.
I mean, it did end up getting more attention than I expected. I mean, going on like Christiane Amanpour was
By the way, she's been very good on this issue, I think.
she's
I mean,
been better than
she's
a lot.
acting within the constraints of CNN, but
Right.
I think her sympathies and her knowledge are in the right place.
Right. I think she knows. I think she gets it, and is trying to draw attention to it, as you said, with
Yeah.
constraints placed on her.
Yeah, so you resign. Did you have so there wasn't any backlash? Did you actually have a conversation with any of the higher ups about your resignation? Like, did you talk to Blinken, for example, ever?
I didn't talk to Blinken about resigning. I did have an opportunity in sort of a broader setting to ask about the Gaza policy earlier on. And I was able to speak with a different senior official before leaving, who, I mean, in many ways, just kind of reiterated that same position of like, we are working tirelessly towards a ceasefire. And
Mm.
just like, wow, okay. Um,
So interestingly, when you brought up the atrocities, they would just there was all the response you say eventually kind of became a deflection. Probably initially they had to defend it because they weren't calling for a ceasefire, but then maybe later on by the spring they're saying, "Oh, we were looking to end the war," right?
Certainly. I mean, this was the position which is part of what
Yeah.
was so maddening, and I think in this question then when Trump actually did use American leverage to push to achieve a ceasefire. And this question of, well, why wasn't Biden ever able to actually do that? Well, because he wasn't willing to use any of America's extensive leverage to actually get there. But in terms of pushback, pardon me, I mean, I think I worried it was going to be worse than it was. But yeah, there was certainly a fair amount of pushback.
Yeah. Well, but you withstood it, and you also another good thing is you had the Quincy Institute, which I'm sure is generally sympathetic to your position as a professional network and maybe support group even. So yeah,
But I was extremely grateful to have had somewhere to come back to, and do want to acknowledge that for so many people, I mean, I admire so much people like Josh Paul or Stacey Gilbert or other people who resigned from state who'd spent years, most if not all of their careers at the State Department, and so for them to burn all those bridges, Hala Rarit, who was the Arabic language spokesperson, you know, for them to burn all that down
yeah,
is extremely
the
admirable.
work of professional lifetimes, really.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Whereas, I was someone who came from an academic background, had spent time in a think tank, ended up being able to go back to the think tank sector. It was, I was extremely lucky. And so again, I just really want to acknowledge those who for whom this really was the extent of their professional network that they were willing to burn down.
right. Yeah, that is extremely admirable. But it also took something for you to do what you did. So it's good that you resigned in the fashion you did. I compliment you on that. Even if you had some internal doubts, how will anyone care? Is it, I was just here for a short period. But anyway, you leave in March 2024. In May 2024, the State Department publishes a document called the NSM 20, or National Security Memorandum 20, which is a required, as I understand, a statutorily required document that they have to publish, analyzing the conduct of militaries that the U.S. government subsidizes and provides armaments to, provides specifically armaments to, for compliance with international humanitarian law or the laws of armed conflict, laws of wars, or I'm talking about just for the audience. Did you? I assume you're familiar with that, with the specific document as it relates to Israel.
Yes, well, that's the document.
And did your bureau, did your team provide any input to it, or?
So I wasn't covering Israel, Palestine, and any of the countries I was that were in my
I see.
role.
Yes.
But I believe that at least there was some input from sort of the Middle East Human Rights Office on that. But that was more, in the purview of people like Stacey Gilbert, who resigned from the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration at State, who had been directly working on the NSM 20 and then had her access as well. Everyone had their access withdrawn, and so then the document was changed, and so what was put out, not what Stacey and her colleagues had found, which was that Israel was in violation of these laws and therefore was no longer eligible to receive U.S. security assistance.
Right, and the position in the document is tortured. I mean, it reminds me, in another life, I was a lawyer. I am a JD, and it reminds me of something like, if you'll forgive me for a little bit of a vulgar example, like Bill Clinton's legalistic arguments about the definition of sexual relations or something like that. I mean, it's absolutely tortured legal reasoning. For instance, they claim it's reasonable to assess that Israel has violated the laws of armed conflict, has violated IHL, has committed war crimes, essentially. But we can't say for sure because of the fog of war. I mean, that's the position. And so do you think that they believe that? Like, it sounds almost existential in its skepticism. I mean, it's
She and her team had come to a completely different conclusion.
Yeah.
Which was Israel is no longer eligible to receive U.S. security assistance. And that's why they lost their access. And then it was changed. And so what was released? And
you're referring to Stacey Gilbert, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and who's Stacey Gilbert? Just for the listeners.
So she was a career civil servant at the State Department. Who had been working on the NSM 20. Had been there for decades. And I remember I had been in touch with her before she resigned, because someone had connected me with her, because I had resigned, and they knew she was thinking about it. And then I think once the NSM 20 came out and it contradicted everything she and the other experts working on it had found, she was like, "That's it. I can't be here anymore."
Yeah, I mean, you have to have a lot of respect for that, and I'm sure she, given her role, she over the years provided input to a lot of NSM 20 documents. But in this one, the boys upstairs have to do it over when she submits it, because she concluded that there were violations of IHL, and they couldn't have that for political reasons. So they have to then have this existentialist view that, who can know, even though it's reasonable to assess.
Similarly, you look at the investigation into the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh.
Yeah.
And how that similarly, although obviously various groups have said, no, it's very clear that she was targeted by the IDF and murdered intentionally. And the U.S. government, their ultimate conclusion was who could say?
they maintained this. I mean, I'm sure you're active user of Twitter for better and worse. I mean, you follow me, so that's for worse in that regard. But I'm sure you saw these absurd displays by the Biden officials where they were continuing to hew to the NSM-20. They said, yeah, it's reasonable to assess their war crimes. We can't know for sure. And it just, the grilling by journalists such as, Ryan Grimm of I guess, Drop Site now he works at. And I mean, it was absurd to maintain this position, or Sam Husseini, it was absurd that the State Department maintained this position, but they did. And, I mean, it shows you, though. So the Trump administration will openly not care about human rights and IHL and the laws of armed conflict, but the Biden administration didn't either. When the rubber hit the road, the realists were proven correct. Yeah, they could come up with these almost like philosophy class level or bogus legal argumentation level arguments, but they're basically saying, when they say it's reasonable to assess, but we can't know for sure that Israel committed war crimes, they're basically saying we don't care about war crimes because it's an ally. That's what that means, But yeah.
Well, I don't know that viewing this through the lens of realism would necessarily make the most sense, because, I mean, as far as kind of broader U.S. national interests or U.S. security, I think it's very clear that this is not a policy that has helped to strengthen U.S. national interests or U.S. security. I think it is much more this question of the domestic political calculus, the strength of the Israel lobby, the wealth of certain very powerful donors who, in the aftermath of Citizens United, have had such an inordinate impact on U.S. politics, such that the Israel lobby used to be much more in touch with sort of the broader population of American Jews who were very broadly pro-Israel, but, many of whom, especially younger American Jews, are appalled by what Israel has been doing and don't condone genocide. And yet that hasn't influenced the position of these, of the Israel lobby, of AIPAC, or other groups, because they're now mostly just carrying out the orders of people like Mary Mabelson and other extremely wealthy donors who now drive the agenda.
Yeah, surely. Did you feel the impact of the Israel lobby just working at the State Department, or was it more kind of this shadowy force because that it's kind of implicit, not explicit in your work? Because you make the interesting point, just to underscore that the realism explanation actually isn't that effective here, because there's no clear argument as to why this relationship and the kind of disgrace and also the increased terrorist risks, the increased security risks to Americans as a result of this policy are in our interest at all.
Exactly.
But go ahead. Yeah.
Well, and just to finish that thought, to the extent that someone is motivated by, I'm not, but if someone is motivated by sort of the long-term security interests of Israel, I don't think this is a smart policy for that either.
Yeah, I agree.
Probably the long-term security interests of Israel are best served by providing Palestinians with a state that they are invested in maintaining, that is interested in having good relations with its neighbor Israel. Whereas as long as they remain stateless and subjugated and occupied and murdered and starved, of course you're going to get resistance and violent resistance, because
right. I mean, that's and this is cast as justification all the time, but it's just a basic historic. And I'm sure you don't, and I don't. Although I have to be honest, a lot of people I know in the Arab world, without getting more specific, because I won't get more specific. I lived in the region for a couple of years. I have family there and so on, but. A lot of people in the Arab world justify 7 October, but, a lot of people in Indochina in the 1950s, 1960s, and 70s justified atrocities by the Viet Minh and Viet Cong. A lot of people in Kenya justified the atrocities of the Mau Mau rebellion. This is something human beings often do when they're in circumstances of this level of oppression. an occupation subjugation. So it's not some kind of historical anomaly, even though of course it's horrible, the violence against civilians that was intentionally carried out by Hamas. This isn't some kind of inexplicable process where we need some kind of explanation about how these must be the worst people in history, or they're the Nazis, or well, it's just those Muslims. God damn it! To articulate the view you heard in your high school class.
No, absolutely. I mean, what do we expect from a people being subjected to annihilation than resistance? But I agree that Islamophobia, I mean, unfortunately, the U.S. policies post 9/11 and this notion of sort of terrorism and the way that the U.S. has long propped up dictators throughout the Middle East, how this sort of perpetuates this cycle. And you know, going back to this question of, you know, what is in Israel's long-term security, you know, I think when you bring that up, there is then a question of, well, what, you know, we're dealing with an Israeli public that seems to be still hell-bent on enacting revenge.
Right.
For the violence and for the humiliation. You know, I think,
and that was made very clear with the public statements and also private statements. I mean, Biden. So first of all, they were explicitly committed. If you read Bob Woodward's, I'm sure you're familiar with all this, and now I don't need to tell you that I'm kind of fake conversation for the benefit of the listeners. So don't think I'm trying to explain this to you really. But you know, the Bob Woodward's book describes how Biden and Blinken were both told of Israeli explicit intention to starve out the civilian population until there was a capitulation or overthrew Hamas, or hand over the hostages. And also Biden, in one of his last interviews, Lawrence O'Donnell, he talked about how Netanyahu's bombing was indiscriminate, and how Netanyahu was pointing to World War II as a justification, where of course the United States in atomic bombings and also the terror bombings of Germany intentionally targeted civilians, right? So, I mean, the signs of murderous intent are all there, and yet they weren't taken seriously, or they didn't care enough about it because the Gazans don't matter to them enough, or there's Israel lobby. I don't know, but some confluence of factors led this superficially woke administration to condone a genocide. It's very, very strange and ominous, and cynicism-inducing development.
Now, I imagine some folks listening may be wondering why we're not talking so much about the new administration. You know, obviously Biden's out, and I mean, just one note there. Now, in some of the exit polling, it's shown that Gaza actually was a crucial issue in suppressing turnout.
Yeah, YouGov says 29% of something like this. I don't want to cite a figure that might not be accurate, but a remarkably high percentage. Go ahead.
Right, that 29% of people who did vote for Biden in 2020 and didn't vote for Harris in 2024 cited Gaza as their number one issue, which was higher than any other issue, including inflation or immigration. And this was, you know, it wasn't that Trump won such a massive victory. It was just that people didn't come out to vote for Harris the way they had voted for Biden, and it was, and their main issue was Gaza. But all that is water under the bridge at this point, because now we have the Trump administration, and as you said, they're not going to even pretend to care about international law or human rights. I think my only hope is that Trump fancies himself a deal maker and thinks he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize, and so wants some kind of deal that would earn him the praise of the Norwegians and the Nobel Committee. And so, you know, probably that will be something with Saudi normalization with Israel. Obviously, the Saudis have said MBS has said he needs to see a Palestinian state with its capital in Jerusalem.
There's also the question of, which we haven't talked about, the question of West Bank annexation, of Area C especially. Will Trump says, oh, he's still thinking about it. I mean, the way he talks in these glib language, just glib kind of trolly language about, you know, these affairs that are affecting all these human lives. But yeah.
Exactly. It's I mean, yeah, and I'm the one who shifted us to talking about Trump, and we opened
Yeah.
with Trump, and again, I don't have any particular additional insights here other than just well, on the one hand, I do welcome that Trump actually used leverage to achieve a ceasefire, but clearly now his plan is to simply ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza. And
And his personnel, the problem is his personnel are fanatical Zionists. I mean, like people who actually believe that resettling some lunatics from Brooklyn
right,
in Israel will bring Christ back. Like that's like the policy of Mike Huckabee
right.
and Hegseth as well. Probably not Rubio, but Hegseth believes in this. So we have basically religious fanatics who think this ethnic cleansing will bring back Christ. Seriously, that's what we're contending with in high office.
Right. Right. And then Elise Stefanik and others referring to
Yeah,
the West Bank as Judea and Samaria. And this is, Tom Cotton introduced legislation to have Judea and Samaria be the word that the U.S.
right.
government
Yeah.
wants to use for the West Bank, which is as a signal of,
I think most of you guys know this who are listening, but Judea and Samaria is the biblical term for the land that roughly corresponds to what we call the West Bank, and the use of the term, of course, implies a territorial claim by Israel.
right, even Bill Clinton used those words.
Yeah, he did. In one of the late campaign rallies, you're sending him to Michigan was a great move by the Harris campaign. Did you vote for Harris? You're kind of a public figure at this point, so I can ask you that. Did you? I was thinking, is it? It's not polite. Did you vote for Harris or a third party or Trump or what?
I no, I did not vote for Trump. Um, I did end up voting for Harris.
Yeah, I did too, but we're actually in the minority in this in the kind of Palestinian solidarity movement, or
Yeah.
me at least half, in the Arab American community. We're in the minority here, Annelle. So we've got some answering to do, I think, for these
Yeah, I mean,
votes.
my vote in Washington D.C. really doesn't matter. If I had been, well, and you know, I think for me the question was there were so many other issues um,
Yeah.
that especially having to do with climate change and the future of immigrants in the United States, and you know, there's a there are a lot of other people that are already being hurt by what Trump is doing and that will be hurt, not only in the immediate, but in the long run, um, that I did see Harris as preferable. But I had no illusions that she was going to do anything different than what Biden
Hmm.
on Palestine.
On the Gaza issue. Okay. Yeah. I had some hope, but you have to wonder how much of this is coping or a rationalization or so forth. But I did have some hope, but I'm not gonna get into my coping. I have a couple questions from viewers, from subscribers to History Speaks. Annelle, that if you don't mind, I'll ask you quickly, and then we'll wrap up. And I really appreciate you coming on. And again, I'm sure your schedule is stuffed with these insane comments by Trump and Netanyahu visit and potential media engagements. I know you're busy right now, so appreciate it. Okay, so the first question is from Saja, and she asks, was there some final straw? Was there a eureka moment that led you politically, intellectually, emotionally, that led you, or some combination of those things that led you to say, I have to resign? Or was it is it hard? Do you not have like a one eureka moment?
I mean, the defunding of UNRWA was horrifying. The extent
Yeah.
to which the Biden administration was willing to go along with this,
Hmm.
the evidence the Israelis
Ridiculous narrative. Yeah.
exactly, and just knowing that Israel has tried to get rid of UNRWA for decades, that really I just found unconscionable.
Yeah, so that was a key. Yeah, and so that's a good point, because it's not only, I mean, these the conditions in Gaza, and my viewers mostly know this, but pre-war Gaza even with the blockade, I think you had figure like 80% of the Gazans were reliant on humanitarian aid to make basic needs met. And if you cut that off, particularly in the war, right, in this horrible war, I mean, the amount of human suffering that would cause is just remarkable, and based on crackpot, frankly, reasoning that UNRWA is some kind of Hamas front. That must have been a shocking moment. Must have been a shocking moment. Another question from Saja. Did public protest or private condemnation, resignation, even your case, did any of this stuff have an impact on the Biden administration, emotionally or politically?
Clearly not.
Yeah.
I think that I resigned was when the uncommitted movement had seemed to maybe be having some kind of impact on the primary process. And that's part of why I thought, look, well, even if it, whatever impact, if I can contribute to that sort of pressure, I would like to try. And I think it just became obvious that nothing anyone did mattered. I remember hoping that maybe some more high-profile people might have quit. I mean, people like Samantha Power, who whole career on opposing the horror of genocide. But
do you know anything about her views on whether Gaza is a genocide, whether Gaza involved murder under the laws of war, or you don't know specifics? Because she seemed very uncomfortable. I will say, in interviews on this, she seemed very uncomfortable defending her position.
I should hope so.
Yeah. But ultimately, it's better to have resigned than say, "Oh, you looked uncomfortable." I mean, I think at least.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, Johann Liebert. These are all kind of fake internet names, by the way. You know how Twitter works, Annelle. You're a millennial, so you better know. Johann Liebert asks about the USA. This is a kind of different question. What do you think of the current Trump administration's kind of attacks on U.S. aid, on that agency? Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I think there are certainly critiques to be made of the ways that historically the U.S. has used some of its aid to sort of further U.S. interests that weren't about actually trying to help conditions for people on the ground. At the same time, there are people who will die as a result of not getting the aid. So I think cutting it off like this is unconscionable. I think there's certainly an argument to be made that the ways that aid was used, or how it was not directed correctly, or it simply enriched certain groups or individuals, that it wasn't actually doing the sorts of good that it often claimed to be doing. That's all fair, but for it to be simply cut off in a manner that will lead to when you're thinking about like AIDS, addressing the AIDS in Africa, for example, like people who won't be able to receive meds and will die as a result, or
right.
kinds of other medical aid simply being cut off. So
like the PEPFAR program.
Exactly, right. And there are many examples of this, and I didn't work in the humanitarian aid space, so I can't necessarily name a lot of really good, cogent examples of this. But again, I think there's certainly a critique that could be made, that has been made, and this administration is certainly making, but that cutting it all off at once, I think was cruel.
Yeah, it's cruel and fitful and impulsive. I agree. Whatever criticisms one can have of these groups, and I think there are criticisms about how we use this stuff for political purposes, and not just obviously they're not pure humanitarian programs, but cutting them off will cost lives. Last question, provocative one. So I'm going to rephrase it a bit because it's a little bit, the phrasing is a little bit polemical. But T-Bull asks whether should we essentially like should we embrace an anti-Zionist project? Should we, in the Israel has been a destabilizing. I think he'd agree has been a destabilizing presence in the region. Now it's committed genocide. Should we embrace an anti-Zionist project of a one-state solution of dismantling Israel as we know it? And then also he asks, in the short run, what specific policies would you favor regarding Israel as punitive measures in response to what they've done, like sanctions, should that be imposed, embargo, BDS, like what do you have any policy ideas as to what should be done in regards to Israel for what it did?
I think first and foremost, it would be great if we actually upheld our own laws, just at the most basic level of, Israel is no longer eligible to receive U.S. security assistance, given its gross violations of human rights, of the Leahy Law, cutting off American humanitarian assistance. Also, the United States, not that I'm expecting this to happen under this administration or any other administration that is likely to come into power, but I think the United States should also uphold international law and should join things like the Rome Statute,
Mm-hmm.
otherwise try and work towards greater accountability and encouraging other countries to follow international law. And the United States has to actually sign on to a lot of these treaties that every other country in the world has signed on to except for the United States. Things like the rights of the child, for example, that the U.S. hasn't even signed on to. So those, I think, are sort of the bare minimum that would do a lot to address Israeli behavior, because we know, or in my understanding, much of Israel's behavior is driven by this blank check that the United States has given it for years, and in particular, since October 7th, just the vast amounts of money and weapons the United States sends them only encourages aggression in Lebanon, in Syria, maybe against Jordan, against Iran, in ways that are, again, fundamentally incompatible with U.S. interests in not getting bogged down in another unnecessary war in the Middle East. I think beyond that, to embrace a sort of anti-Zionist project, I mean, what exactly does that mean? As they said, perhaps a one-state solution. I think that's one option. I think that recognizing the human rights of Palestinians and the political rights of Palestinians as part of that would certainly go a long way. And yet at the same time, I don't know. I also, I'm not Palestinian, and I don't want to articulate, a plan that I think makes sense to me. I think for many, many Palestinians, they don't necessarily only want sort of rights within the state of Israel. They want their own state. And I think the right to self-determination is fundamental and has been the basis of so much of our international system for decades. So, I also at the same time am just cognizant of like, well, what should we do now, given that Trump's in power? And sure,
Right.
it would be great if we would actually start to do things like actually follow our own laws, but I don't expect this administration to do that.
No.
So what should people do now? I mean, it does seem that this president is perhaps somewhat more attuned to public pushback than the Biden administration was. And so, in particular,
More attuned to social media too.
exactly, more attuned to social
Yeah.
media. I have thought about, to what extent trying to get, obviously he's very tuned into his base, for whom support for the state of Israel is seen as sort of unquestioned. But I do think for many people, just, the horrors of what the people of Gaza have gone through and are still going through. I do think that those resonate even for, deep red Trump supporters. And so I think
As does you can also make a very, even if you don't talk about the of course you should talk about the well-being of the people of Gaza, but even assuming they're indifferent to that, there's a very robust case from self-interest that can be made against these policies.
Well, certainly.
And some are making it. Some in the MAGA world, it's still a minority, but some are making it.
Well, absolutely. And, it was just in reaction to his question, his comments yesterday of like, how on earth would committing U.S. soldiers to take over responsibility for the occupation of Gaza, like, how is this America first? How is this make America great again? So I hope that at least the reaction to that maybe will have an influence on his thinking on this. But yeah, it's not looking good.
No. All right, Annelle, thank you so much for your voice, your moral clarity, your knowledge, experience. Appreciate you taking the time to do my little YouTube channel in the midst of this crazy environment. And I'll continue to follow you on Twitter, and I'm sure my followers will be interested to follow your work at Quincy as well, and to see what your career brings in the future. And you're an important voice for this pivotal cause, and we're going to have to, people who are people in intellectual life, analysts, we're going to have to work through together what this means for the United States, how we can effectively help the people of Gaza. We're just going to have to work through this process, because I don't think we frankly have all the answers yet. And one thing I appreciate about talking to you is that you're candid when you don't have the answers. You're not just thinking, how do I make a concise, snappy answer? You're trying to work through the facts and the law and the values. So I do appreciate you coming on quite a bit. So thank you.
Well, thank you for everything you've done to try to draw attention to this. So appreciate all of your time.
Thank you very much. Take care, Annelle.
Thank you.
Stop.